October 12, 1883. The wind coming down from the Gentry Peaks already carried the memory of ice. Maeve sat on the porch step, her needle flashing in the thin afternoon light as she mended a burlap sack. The thread was coarse, and the skin of her fingers, though toughened by a life of making do, was raw at the tips. Beside her, their German shepherd, Kaiser, lay with his great head on his paws, but he was not asleep. His ears twitched at every whisper of wind, his amber eyes fixed on the path that led down to the town of redemption. He had been this way for 3 days, a statue of uneasy patience. Inside, Sabine was counting the jars of pickled beets and beans, her movements sharp and precise. They were identical, 17 years old, with the same dark, serious eyes and hair the color of wet river stones, but they moved through the world in different ways. Maeve was the anchor, the reader, the watcher. Sabine was the current, the door, the builder. The sack Maeve was mending had held their last purchase of flour. It was nearly empty, just like the coin purse in the kitchen drawer. A home is not the walls that hold you, but the people who refuse to let you fall. Their father had been a man of grand pronouncements and evaporating promises. He spoke of silver veins and timber claims, of futures that glittered just over the next rise, but his hands were soft and his gaze was always fixed on the horizon, never on the ground beneath his feet. Their mother, dead a year now from a fever the doctor had no name for, had been the one who understood the earth. She had taught them the language of plants, the rhythm of the seasons, the quiet calculus of survival. Her worn leather book, filled with drawings of roots and leaves and notes on their uses, was the only thing of true value they had left. When their father brought home a new wife, a woman with a brittle smile and eyes that assessed every corner of the house for its worth, the girls knew their time was running out. The final blow came not with a shout, but with a folded piece of paper left on the kitchen table. He and his new wife were gone. Gone to California, the note said, where a man of vision could finally prosper. He left them what little food was in the larder, a few dollars, and a deed. It was for a trapper's cabin his own father had built and abandoned decades ago, high up on the mountain. An inheritance, he had written. To start your own lives, it was not an inheritance. It was an eviction. The walk up the mountain was a silent pilgrimage. They carried what they could. Maeve had the precious book and a packet of their mother's seeds wrapped in oilcloth. Sabine carried an axe and a cast-iron skillet. Kaiser trotted between them, his presence a low, steady comfort. The town had offered its usual brand of pity, the kind that came with sad looks and quiet gossip. The pastor's wife had suggested they could find work as scullery maids, separating them for the first time in their lives. They had refused. They would take their chances with the mountain. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and the pines grew thicker, their needles muffling the sounds of the world below. The path dwindled to a deer trail, then nothing at all. They followed the creek their father had described, its water cold and clear over mossy stones. They did not speak of their father, or the woman he'd left with. They did not speak of the betrayal. They spoke only of the task ahead, their voices small against the vastness of the wilderness. The roof will be first, Sabine said, her eye scanning the tree line. If the walls still stand, Maeve nodded, shifting the weight of the pack on her shoulders. The book has a chapter on making pitch from pine sap. For sealant. They found the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the western ridge, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. It was worse than they had imagined. The word cabin was generous. It was a skeleton. The roof had a hole the size of a wagon wheel, a gaping wound open to the sky. The door hung from a single leather hinge. One of the 4 walls, the one facing the wind, had partially collapsed, a messy pile of rotted logs and dried mud chinking. Inside, the floor was a carpet of damp leaves, pine needles, and the droppings of countless small animals who had called it home. A stone hearth stood against the back wall, choked with debris. It was a ruin, a testament to failure and decay. For a long moment, they just stood there, the silence broken only by the sigh of the wind through the broken walls. Despair, cold and heavy, settled in Maeve's stomach. This was not a beginning. It was an end. But then Kaiser nudged her hand with his wet nose and looked toward the structure, letting out a low, questioning whine. Sabine took a deep breath, the sound of it sharp in the cold air. She walked to the collapsed wall and kicked at a loose log. "The foundation stones are good," she said, her voice flat and determined. "The hearth is solid." It's enough. That night, they slept outside, huddled together under their one blanket with Kaiser pressed between them, his body a furnace of warmth and loyalty. The stars were brilliant and terrifying in their cold distance. They had nothing left but each other, a dog, and a pile of rocks and rotting wood. It would have to be enough. The first week was a blur of brutal, relentless labor. Their hands, already calloused, bled and blistered. Their muscles screamed with a fire they had never known. They worked from the first hint of dawn until the light failed, fueled by a grim and silent urgency. Winter was not a concept, it was a predator, and they could hear its footsteps in the rustling leaves. Sabine, with the axe, was a force of nature. She felled for young pines from a thick stand near the creek, her swings economical and powerful. She taught herself to limb them, to notch them, to roll them into place to rebuild the collapsed wall. Maeve's work was smaller, but no less vital. She used the skillet to haul water from the creek and mix it with clay and dry grass, creating a thick, sticky daub to chink the walls. She spent hours on her knees, packing the mixture into every crack and crevice, her fingers numb with cold. They were a machine of two parts, each anticipating the other's needs without a word. When Sabine's hands were raw from the axe handle, Maeve would have a strip of cloth ready to bind them. When Maeve's back seized up from bending over the walls, Sabine would bring her water and wordlessly take over the task for an hour. Their greatest challenge was the roof. The hole was too large to patch with logs. They needed a different solution. Maeve found it, as she knew she would, in their mother's book. There was a section on building sod roofs, common in the old country. It described how to build a lattice of green saplings, cover it with bark, and then lay thick squares of turf on top, grass side down first, then another layer grass side up. It was heavy, miserable work. They had to cut the saplings, strip them, and lash them together with roots they dug from the creek bank. Then they spent 2 full days carving out squares of turf from a small meadow upstream, carrying the heavy, damp pieces back to the cabin. Kaiser seemed to understand their desperation. He did not beg for food or attention. He patrolled the perimeter of their small work site, a silent guardian. One morning, he returned with a fat rabbit dangling from his mouth, which he laid carefully at Sabine's feet. It was their first fresh meat in a week, and the simple, savory stew they made that night felt like a feast. As they ate, sitting by their fire, Maeve watched her sister. A smudge of dirt streaked Sabine's cheek, and her hair was matted with pine needles, but her eyes, reflecting the firelight, were clear and steady. The city-bred softness had already been burned away from them. The mountain was remaking them in its own image, hard, resilient, and unyielding. The day they finally laid the last piece of sod on the roof, a cold rain began to fall. They scrambled inside, holding their breath, and watched. A few drops found their way through the new chinking, but the roof held. They stood in the center of the small, dim room, listening to the drumbeat of rain on the earth above their heads, and for the first time in a month, they felt a sliver of something that resembled hope. It was not a home yet, not truly. But it was a shelter. It was theirs. They had built it not with money or with help, but with the strength of their own backs and the ghost of their mother's wisdom. That night, as the storm raged outside, Maeve opened the book. She didn't look for instructions. She just turned the pages, looking at her mother's elegant, practical script. It was a voice from a world that had vanished, a world of warmth and safety. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek before she wiped it away. She would not allow herself the luxury of grief. Grief was a weight, and they could not afford to carry anything that did not help them survive. Sabine, mending a tear in her shirt by the fire, saw the gesture. She said nothing, but reached over and laid her hand on her sister's for just a moment. The touch was rough, calloused, and chapped, but it said everything that needed to be said. We are still here. Together. With the shelter secured, their focus shifted to food. The few jars and sacks they'd carried up the mountain were dwindling at an alarming rate. Winter would last for months, and they knew they would be completely cut off once the deep snows came. The mountain would have to provide for them. Every morning, Maeve would take the book and a woven basket and walk the woods, with Kaiser as her scout. She learned to see the world through her mother's eyes. She was not just looking at a forest, she was looking at a larder. She found the last of the season's wild cranberries, tart and red, hidden in a boggy patch near the creek. She dug for cattail roots and the starchy tubers of wild onions. The book showed her how to identify rose hips, which were high in nutrients and could be dried for tea, and how to find the caches of nuts hidden by squirrels. Sabine, meanwhile, focused on protein. She was not a hunter and they had no rifle, but she was patient and clever. She spent days observing game trails, learning the habits of the rabbits and grouse that lived in the woods around them. She used twine to fashion simple but effective snares, placing them in the dense underbrush. For the first few days, they came up empty, a frustrating and worrying failure. But Sabine did not give up. She moved the snares, adjusted their height, and baited them with the cranberries Maeve had found. One morning, she returned to the cabin with 2 plump grouse. The triumph in her eyes was more potent than any spoken word. Their most ambitious project was building a small, stone-lined root cellar against the north side of the cabin. The book stressed the importance of keeping root vegetables and preserved foods at a constant, cool temperature. They dug into the hillside, a back-breaking task of loosening earth and rock with a sharpened stick and hauling it away in the skillet. They lined the hole with flat stones they carried from the creek bed, fitting them together like a puzzle. It took them 4 days of relentless, monotonous work. At one point, a large boulder, half buried in the earth, refused to budge. Sabine threw her entire weight against it, grunting with effort, but it was useless. She slumped against it, defeated. "It won't move," she said, her voice raspy with exhaustion. "We can't finish it." Maeve came and stood beside her. She looked at the boulder, then at the hole they had dug. She remembered her mother telling her once that you don't fight the mountain, you work with it. "We don't have to move it," Maeve said quietly. "We build around it. It will be one of the walls." It was a simple observation, but it broke the spell of frustration. They incorporated the boulder into their design, and the cellar was finished the next day. As they stored their meager hoard, the onions, the roots, the small sack of dried berries, it felt like they were burying treasure. Each item was a victory, a small defiance against the coming cold. They were no longer just surviving day to day. They were planning. They were preparing. They were putting down roots in this wild, unforgiving place. The first snow fell in late November. It did not come as a storm, but as a quiet, feathery descent of flakes that transformed the world overnight. When they woke, the forest was draped in white, the sharp edges of the landscape softened into gentle curves. The silence was profound, broken only by the gurgle of the creek, which had not yet frozen over. The beauty of it was breathtaking, but it carried a chilling message. The door was closing. The world below was now a distant country, and they were on their own. They established a strict winter routine. Mornings were for work, checking the snares, gathering firewood, ensuring the cabin was secure. Afternoons were for domestic tasks, mending clothes, preparing food, grinding dried rose hips for tea. Evenings were for the fire. They would sit on the floor, Kaiser at their feet, and Maeve would read aloud from their mother's book. She read not just the practical entries, but the small notes her mother had scribbled in the margins, observations about the weather, a recipe for a simple cake, a pressed wildflower. It was a way of keeping her with them, of filling the immense silence of the cabin with a familiar voice. The isolation was a physical presence. Some days, the sameness of their existence was suffocating. The same view from the door, the same taste of rabbit stew, the same 4 walls pressing in on them. One afternoon, a fever took hold of Sabine. She awoke from a nap shivering violently, her skin burning hot to the touch. Maeve felt a surge of pure terror. Out here, a simple sickness could be a death sentence. But panic was a luxury she could not afford. She turned to the book, her hand shaking as she flipped through the pages. She found the section on fevers. Willow bark tea to reduce the heat, a poultice of yarrow to draw it out. She spent the next 2 days as a nurse, a task for which she had no training, only a mother's instructions. She brewed the bitter tea, forcing her sister to drink it. She bathed Sabine's forehead with snow-melted water. She sat by her side through the long, dark nights, listening to her ragged breathing and praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Sabine woke up, weak and drenched in sweat, but her eyes were clear. "You look worried," she whispered. Maeve just shook her head, a wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy. "I wasn't," she lied softly. The incident changed them. It had been their first true test against the indifferent cruelty of nature, and they had won. They had relied on their mother's knowledge and their own resolve, and it had been enough. They were not merely lucky. They were competent. The blizzard arrived in the heart of January. It started, like the first snow, with a gentle fall, but this was different. The wind had a high, vicious whine, and the flakes were small and hard, like pellets of sand. By nightfall, it was a full-blown tempest, a roaring, white chaos that erased the world. The wind shrieked like a living thing, and the cabin groaned under the assault. Snow piled up against the walls, sealing them in. For 3 days, they lived in a twilight world, the only light coming from the fire and a single tallow candle. The sound was constant, a physical pressure that wore on the nerves. They couldn't see out, couldn't get out. They were buried alive. Their firewood, which had seemed like an ample supply, was now dwindling at a terrifying rate. They burned it sparingly, huddling together under their blanket for warmth. The cold seeped through the chinking in the walls, a persistent, invasive chill. Kaiser, usually so stoic, whined low in his throat, pacing the small room. He knew this was a different kind of storm. He seemed to sense their fear and began to refuse his full share of their meager meals, pushing the bowl back toward them with his nose. The crisis came on the 3rd night. The smoke from the hearth, which usually drew cleanly up the chimney, began to billow back into the room. The air grew thick and acrid, stinging their eyes and catching in their throats. Maeve, her heart pounding, realized what had happened. The chimney, a simple stack of stones, must be blocked by a cap of snow and ice. They were faced with an impossible choice. They could let the fire go out and risk freezing to death in the unrelenting cold. Or they could keep it lit and suffocate on the smoke. Or, there was a third option, a terrifying gamble. Someone would have to go outside, onto the roof, in the middle of the blizzard, and clear the chimney. "I'll do it," Sabine said immediately, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I'm stronger," Maeve didn't argue. She found their only piece of rope and tied it securely around her sister's waist. "I'll hold on," she said, her own voice trembling slightly. "I won't let you go." Sabine pulled her collar up, tied a rag over her mouth and nose, and took the fire poker. Maeve braced herself against the wall, the rope wrapped tight around her wrists, as Sabine unbarred the door. The blizzard exploded into the cabin, a furious blast of wind and blinding snow. Sabine disappeared into the white fury. Maeve could feel the rope go taut, then slack, as her sister fought her way onto the low roof. She could hear nothing but the roar of the storm. Minutes felt like hours. She just held on, her knuckles white, her body a rigid anchor against the storm's pull. Suddenly, she felt 3 sharp tugs on the rope, their prearranged signal. She pulled with all her might, and Sabine stumbled back inside, covered in snow, her face rimed with ice, but alive. A moment later, the smoke in the room swirled and began to draw up the chimney. They had done it. They collapsed by the hearth, coughing and shivering, too exhausted to speak. They had faced the beast and had not been consumed. When the storm finally broke, the silence it left behind was as stunning as the noise had been. Maeve unbarred the door and pushed. It wouldn't budge. A wall of snow, packed hard by the wind, held it shut. It took them an hour of digging with a skillet and a piece of bark to carve a tunnel out into the new world. The sun was brilliant on a landscape of impossible white. The snow was drifted up to the roofline of the cabin, the trees heavy and bowed. It was a place of stark, majestic, and lethal beauty. They had survived. The knowledge settled not with a shout of triumph, but with a deep, quiet sense of awe. They stood in their narrow tunnel, blinking in the bright light, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The world had been wiped clean, and so had they. The petty grievances and fears of their old life were gone, scoured away by the wind and the cold. They were no longer the abandoned daughters from the town of redemption. They were inhabitants of this place, bound to it by the work of their hands and the will to live. A few days later, Kaiser began barking excitedly at the edge of the woods. The girls followed him and found a gift from the storm. A young buck, caught in a deep drift, had exhausted itself and frozen. It was a tragic sight, but for them, it was a miracle. The deer represented a wealth of food, enough to see them through the rest of the winter and beyond. Dressing the animal was a grim, bloody business they had only read about in their mother's book, but they did it with a methodical focus, wasting nothing. They smoked strips of venison over the fire, rendered the fat into tallow for candles and soap, and boiled the bones for broth. The cabin, once a place of desperate survival, now felt abundant. They had faced the worst the mountain could throw at them and had emerged not just intact, but stronger. A new confidence settled into their bones. They had been tested by fire and ice, and they had not been found wanting. The fear that had been their constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of capability. They belonged here. They had earned their place. Spring arrived not as a single event, but as a slow, tentative awakening. The snow melted, the creek swelled to a rushing torrent, and the first green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth. The world felt reborn, and so did they. One afternoon in late May, a man appeared at the edge of their clearing. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the black, dusty clothes of a traveling preacher. He led a tired-looking horse and stared at their small, orderly homestead as if it were a hallucination. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, saying he'd lost his way on the path to a mining camp. He had expected to find a ruin, a place the locals in Redemption spoke of with pity. The story of the two abandoned girls was a town tragedy, a cautionary tale about a feckless father. He had not expected to find this, a sturdy cabin with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney, a neatly stacked woodpile, and two healthy, self-possessed young women who looked at him not with fear or desperation, but with a calm, assessing curiosity. They offered him water for his horse and a bowl of venison stew for himself. He ate like a man starved, all the while studying them with a mixture of shock and wonder. He asked them how they had survived the winter. "We were prepared," Maeve said simply. He told them the town prayed for them. He said their father was a scoundrel who would surely face his own judgment one day. He spoke of rescue, of finding them a proper Christian home where they could be cared for. He meant to be kind, but his words were an insult. They did not need rescuing. They were not lost. Sabine, who had been quietly sharpening the axe on a whetstone, finally looked up. "We have a home, sir," she said, her voice even and hard as the stone in her hand. "We built it." The preacher was silenced. He saw the calluses on their hands, the strength in their posture, the utter lack of self-pity in their eyes. He had come expecting to be a savior to two helpless victims, but he found himself in the presence of something he could not quite comprehend. He stayed the night, sleeping by their fire, and left the next morning after a breakfast of dried berries and hot tea. He tried to offer them money, but they refused. They traded him a small pouch of smoked venison for a handful of salt, an exchange between equals. As he rode away, he kept looking back, shaking his head in disbelief. He had stumbled upon a story far stranger and more profound than the one the town told. The preacher's story changed their standing in the world below. He did not speak of victims, he spoke of miracles. He described a homestead carved out of the wilderness by two young women with nothing but their own grit. Pity turned to awe, and then to a kind of folk legend. A few people from town, emboldened by the preacher's tale, made the journey up the mountain. Not to save them, but to trade. A prospector traded them a bag of flour and 2 good blankets for a side of venison. The blacksmith's wife traded them needles, thread, and a packet of vegetable seeds for a jar of Maeve's rose-hip salve, the recipe taken directly from their mother's book. They became a part of the region's sparse economy, respected for their competence. They did not need the town, but they learned to coexist with it on their own terms. That second summer, they transformed the cabin from a shelter into a true home. With the new seeds, they planted a proper garden, fencing it with a low stone wall to keep out the deer. They dug a channel from the creek to irrigate it. Sabine, using the skills she had learned rebuilding their wall, expanded the hearth and built a small stone oven beside it. For the first time in 2 years, they smelled the scent of baking bread. They were no longer just surviving. They were living. They were creating a place of permanence and simple beauty. The paradise they built was not one of ease, but one of purpose. Every stone in the wall, every plant in the garden, every log in the woodpile was a testament to their labor and their will. Years passed. The seasons turned, each one leaving them more deeply rooted in their mountain home. The girls became women, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their bodies strong and capable. Their life was one of hard work and quiet rhythms, governed by the sun and the needs of the land. They were not lonely. They had each other, and they had Kaiser, who was now old and grey-muzzled, content to sleep in the sun on the porch they had built. They had created a world for themselves that was complete. One day, a rider from town brought them a letter. It had been sitting at the post office for a month. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky and unfamiliar. Maeve opened it. It was from their father. He was in a charity hospital in Sacramento. The gold rush had been a bust, his new wife had left him, and his health was broken. The letter was a rambling, self-pitying plea. He wrote of his regrets, of his love for them, of his desire to come home. He asked for their forgiveness. He asked if he could spend his final days in the cabin his own father had built. Maeve read the letter aloud to Sabine as they sat by the fire that evening. When she was finished, she folded it carefully and looked at her sister. Sabine stared into the flames for a long time, her expression unreadable. The man who had written that letter was a stranger to them now, a ghost from a life that no longer felt like their own. He was asking to return to a place that had never been his, to a home he had no part in making. Sabine finally looked at Maeve. She said nothing, but simply reached out, took the letter from her sister's hand, and placed it gently in the fire. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. It was not an act of vengeance or of hatred. It was an act of finality. His story was over. Theirs was still being written. Outside, the first snow of another winter began to fall, dusting the great, silent peaks. It was just weather. The fire was warm. They were home.